On the morning of August 9, 2018, more than 50 students from a religious school boarded a school bus for a field trip to a religious shrine and cemetery near Sada, in Houthi-controlled northern Yemen. When the bus stopped in a market to purchase water, an airstrike by the Saudi Arabia-led coalition in Yemen hit the bus. The attack killed at least 26 students and 4 teachers. Survivors and their families were still grappling with the attack's devastating impact on their physical and mental well-being months and years after the attack. But the victims of this airstrike were only a fraction of the students, teachers, and educational institutions affected by attacks on education in recent years. The Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack compiled over 11,000 reports of attacks on education or military use of educational facilities globally between 2015 and 2019. These incidents harmed over 22,000 students, teachers, and education personnel and occurred in at least 93 countries and in every region of the world.
These findings come from Education Under Attack 2020, the most recent report from the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. The report tracks attacks in situations of armed conflict and insecurity. Incidents are collected from the United Nations, non-governmental organizations, media, and partners in the field. Report data also feeds into the monitoring of Sustainable Development Goal 4, Quality Education, which tracks progress on the right to education for all. Attacks on education include any threat or actual use of force by state forces or non-state armed groups on students, education personnel, or educational infrastructure or materials. Schools are attacked for many reasons, including because they are seen as symbols of government, they are thought to impose a foreign culture or language, or because some armed groups oppose girls' learning. Schools are a soft target that are easy to attack or use for military purposes. Military use occurs when armed forces or armed groups use schools or universities for barracks, weapon stores, training facilities, or other purposes. Attacks on education and the military use of schools not only lead to the death and injury of students and teachers, they also instill fear and keep students from learning and communities from thriving.
The Democratic Republic of Congo and Yemen were the most affected countries, according to GCPA research. Approximately 1/3 of all reported attacks on education globally occurred in these two countries between 2015 and 2019. GCPA tracks 5 categories of attacks on education and the military use of schools. This video shares some of the key findings for each of these categories. Attacks on schools remained the most common violation between 2015 and 2019. There were 7,300 attacks on schools, which made up just over 2/3 of all reported attacks on education. These included arson, explosives, and gunfire, both collateral and targeted. We identified the most reported incidents in DRC and Yemen, with over 1,500 in each country. In Afghanistan, approximately 60% of all attacks on schools in 2018 and 2019 involved explosive weapons. In Syria, the UN found that over 40% of schools were damaged or destroyed since the beginning of the conflict.
In other cases, students, teachers, and school staff themselves become targets. These direct attacks harmed thousands globally, with Cameroon, Palestine, and the Philippines among the most heavily affected. In northeast Nigeria, a faction of Boko Haram reportedly kidnapped 110 girls and 1 boy from a girls' school in Dapchi in February 2018. all but one of the schoolgirls were released. The school later reopened, but more than 3/4 of students didn't attend, partly due to fears for their safety. State forces and non-state armed groups recruited children at or on the way to or from school in 17 countries between 2015 and 2019. In Yemen, for instance, in 2018, the UN verified that students were recruited and mobilized from 20 schools, including 4 girls' schools.
Armed forces, security forces, or armed groups were reportedly responsible for sexual violence in or on the way to or from schools and universities in at least 17 countries between 2015 and 2019. In 2017, during fighting in the Kasai region of DRC, militia members abducted female students to be recruited into armed groups or forced into marriages with militia members, many of whom were subjected to sexual violence.
University students, professors, and facilities also came under attack in at least 70 countries around the world. Over 9,000 higher education students and staff were killed or harmed during attacks, and university infrastructure was attacked 300 times between 2015 and 2019. For instance, in India, more than 1,000 students and higher education staff were injured, detained, or killed between 2018 and 2019, primarily due to excessive use of force during education-related protests. And university buildings were attacked on several occasions there, such as when a grenade exploded outside the main entrance of a university in Jammu and Kashmir, reportedly in connection to a non-state armed group in November 2019. There were over 500 cases of armed forces, other state actors, or armed groups using schools or universities for military purposes between 2015 and 2019. GCPIA identified military use across 34 countries.
GCPIA's research has found that attacks on education and the military use of schools particularly impact women and girls. In some cases, armed groups use violence to stop girls from pursuing an education, such as in Pakistan, where the UN verified that armed actors damaged 14 girls' schools in a single night in 2018. In Sudan, while schools were closed due to COVID-19, paramilitary forces began using a girls' school in South Kordofan as a training center in June. When schools reopened in July, the 400 students attending this girls' school were reportedly unable to return to classes since the school was still being used for military purposes.
The Safe Schools Declaration is a critical tool for preventing and responding to attacks on education.
I welcome steps taken by member states to protect educational institutions and those who need them. These include the Safe Schools Declaration, which aims to protect education from attack and to prevent schools and universities from being used for military purposes.
To ensure safe education for students and educators, GCPIA calls on all states to endorse and implement the Safe Schools Declaration and recommends that states and stakeholders restrict military use, including by incorporating the guidelines for protecting schools and universities into military doctrine and training, ensure accountability for perpetrators of attacks on education,
develop safety and security plans to prevent and respond to attacks on education, and which take into account the specific needs of women and girls. Provide non-discriminatory assistance for all survivors of attacks on education. Strengthen monitoring and reporting of attacks on education, including by disaggregating data by type of attack, level of schooling, and gender.
schools should always be safe havens for children. We must remind the world that children have a right to continue to learn unimpeded, even in times of war and even in times of pandemics.